Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Nye, Director of the NIH Brain Initiative. I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion where we will discuss aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion and the Brain Initiative and science more broadly. Our position of the Brain Initiative, and one that I feel quite passionately about, is that we need to have inclusivity, diverse voices in our enterprise in order for us to do the best science we can and to serve the most people across society. And so these are topics that have been discussed over the years. Issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion have come up over the last year because of a number of tragic events. For us, this is an opportunity to really reflect on what can we do, who we are as a people. The purpose of today's panel is really to talk about some successes that we've seen by our panelists here, and we'll get to them in a moment in turn, to give people some ideas about what can you do on the ground to stand up a more diverse workforce, both within your own immediate circle as well as with your larger circles and across society. So this is going to be not so much about the discussion about many of the deeper motivations behind this, although I'm sure we are having those as well. But really, what can we do? What actions can we take to make our immediate circles more diverse and inclusive, our work better, but also how can we make our larger circles, our larger web of interactions, a better, more diverse and more equitable one? So that's the goals. These are the goals here. We'll be following up with you as we go along. We have a Q&A box. We do encourage you to ask questions. I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion. I'm going to hand it over to my co-moderator, Dr. Elba Serrano, who will take it away. And then we're going to hear from our panelists here who have some great stories and perspectives to share about how they're looking at these issues and what they're doing to address these issues on the ground in their own lives every day. So Dr. Serrano, please.
Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone. My name is Elba Serrano, and I'm a Regents Professor at New Mexico State University, 50 miles north of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez. And I would like to acknowledge that I work and live on the ancestral and current homelands of the indigenous peoples who have lived in southern New Mexico for generations, the Mescalero Apache, the Chiricahua Apache, Tortugas Pueblo, and the Piro Manso and Tiwa people. In addition to leading a neuroscience research program, I have served as the PI of NIH programs to broaden participation, RISE, and BP Endure. And I currently serve as the NMSU lead PI for the NSF-HSI National STEM Resource Hub that builds capacity for STEM education grants at the over 550 Hispanic serving institutions across the country. I also am a member of the Brain Multi-Council Working Group. We thank you for attending this workshop, which, as John says, has a very specific goal, and that is to move to actions that strengthen diversity, equity, and inclusion in neuroscience. And so we hope that everyone leaves the session with at least one action they intend to undertake to change the landscape of the neuroscience community. So in this session, 4 dynamic and accomplished panelists are going to share their stories and their wisdom. They're each going to speak for about 4 or 5 minutes. And we want this to be an interactive session, and we look to you to shape the conversation. So please enter your questions in the chat. At the conclusion of their presentations, we will initiate a dialogue with the attendees. So I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Bruce Fishel. Dr. Fishel is involved with My Brother's Keeper, an organization dedicated to empowering and supporting young people in the city of Cambridge who are struggling with social, mental, economic, and educational inequities. He is a professor in radiology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, where he also serves as the director of the computational core at Martino Center. He is also the co-founder of Cordiometrics, a startup that develops neuroimaging software to aid in the detection and or diagnosis of neurological disorders and conditions. Dr. Fishel's research focuses on the development of techniques for the automatic construction and utilization of geometrically accurate and topologically correct models of the human cerebral cortex. So welcome, Bruce. Over to you now.
Thank you, Utta, and thanks, John. So that's a lengthy introduction, but I think it leaves out what's probably my most important qualification for this panel, which is that I'm a volunteer youth soccer coach. And I've done that in Cambridge since my son was 7. He's 18 now, he just graduated. And that's actually relevant to kind of how I got involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because in the summer of 2020, we all watched the horrific events that occurred in Minnesota that, were just so appalling. And I knew that I wanted to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. But I didn't really know what that meant. And I went to a rally on the Cambridge Common that had been organized by my brother's keeper and by actually the JV soccer coach from the local high school. And at the rally, they had a bunch of kids that I had coached speak, which I didn't know that was going to happen. And, one of them in particular has been a friend of my son since they were 5. His mother's Jamaican. And he described his experiences growing up in Cambridge, which, we think of as, at least in Cambridge, we think of it as like the heart of liberal America. And it was just a different experience than my son's. He goes into supermarkets and people follow him the minute he walks in. He gets accused of things, just based on the color of his skin. And it was kind of appalling, and I don't know, in many ways felt kind of shameful to me that, his experience had been adjacent to my son's for more than a decade. Like I saw this kid all the time. And it just never occurred to me, for no very good reason, that his life was so substantially different and more difficult. And so I was kind of, at the time I had an NIH grant that was in its 4th year to do the development of algorithms for longitudinal analysis and brain imaging. And part of that these days involves manual labeling, particularly with the advent of deep learning, manual labeling becomes much more important to us all. And so I reached out to the Cambridge chapter of My Brother's Keeper, which is an organization founded by President Obama, I think in 2013-ish. And they were great. And together we established an internship where we had 15 kids manually labeling brain structures from MRI scans. We kind of interspersed these with pedagogical lectures on brain anatomy and brain imaging and neuroscience more generally, and various other topics that My Brother's Keeper engaged in. And so we did that successfully during the summer of the pandemic. We just recently got a supplement for my UO1, my Brain Initiative UO1. And we're going to do that again this summer. We're going to have different targets. Last summer we did the hippocampus. This summer is going to be more painful for the kids. We're going to do the cerebral vasculature and probably cortical layers. But it's been a massively fulfilling experience. The kids are great. They are so motivated, and you can just see the impact you have on these kids' lives. Who they come into the program. We do these kind of entry interviews and exit interviews, and they tell us things like, before I did this program, I just assumed I'd work in a store 24 hours. I was always interested in medicine, but I just, just wasn't for me, I assumed. And so it's just been, it's been hugely gratifying from a social perspective. It's been valuable for us. We've gotten things we would never have gotten otherwise. Having 15 kids do manual labeling has just been a goldmine for us algorithmically and scientifically. And our goal for them is to be able to write a scientific paper that they publish every summer describing the data that they produced. Anyway, so that's my story, Alba.
Thank you, Bruce. That's such a great example of how, by connecting to our community, to our families, we can find inspiration that leads to an authentic opportunity for change. So thank you. I love hearing that story every time you have said it. I've heard it a few times as we prepared for this session. Our next speaker is Megan Kerry, who is speaking to us from Portugal. And Dr. Kerry is the group leader in the neuroscience program at the Champalimau Center for the Unknown in Lisbon, Portugal. She is an international early career scientist of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and her research combines quantitative behavioral analysis, genetics, and physiology to understand how the brain controls learned and coordinated movements. She is the chair-elect of the ALBA Network for Equity and Diversity in Brain Sciences. ALBA aims to counteract bias, promotes the careers of underrepresented groups by providing networking and mentorship opportunities, and recognizes outstanding contributions to science and diversity. Thank you, Megan, for joining us today.
Thank you. So I thought I would just mention a bit how I became active in this area. And I think a lot of women and people from underrepresented groups in science sort of start off hoping that these problems are something in the past and that they will no longer be relevant for them as they kind of come up through their career. And that is certainly the way I started as a PhD student. I remember vividly sitting and listening to Nancy Hopkins give a talk about her time, measuring the labs at MIT and finding these really stark quantitative differences between the female and male faculty. And I remember thinking in the back of my mind, well, gosh, I'm glad I'm a scientist now and not in that generation, and hoping. But I also did hear her saying that she also had hoped the same, of course, and started to see throughout her time that things hadn't improved as much as she would want. I then started my postdoc at Harvard right around the same time, I guess, just after Larry Summers, who was then the president of Harvard University, had made some rather unfortunate comments about what he speculated were the reasons that women might not be as plentiful, shall we say, in science. And I won't say what he said, but the fact was that when I heard what he said, I was outraged in a very personal way, and I knew he was wrong, but I wasn't able to articulate why, and that really bothered me. What I did know for sure was that the comments that he had made were not scholarly, and I didn't think that it was right for the president of a university to be speaking in a non-scholarly way about such an important topic. And so that was really, I think, when I really started educating myself. And I read, which I recommend to everybody, the book Why So Slow by Virginia Valian, which is a classic now. And she made a couple really important points in that book. One is that the leaky pipeline is similar, not just for women, but it has a very stereotyped progression the results are very similar for both gender and race, which has important implications for what the sources of the problem are and therefore what solutions are needed in order to address it. And also that that same pattern is shared across different professions, which also is very relevant when you're thinking about how to address what the actual underlying problem is. So, anyway, by the time I became a PI, I did start seeing more and more instances of various kinds of bias in my own daily experience. I started taking on some leadership roles, organizing various conferences, other leadership roles through FENS here in Europe. And I started just embedding best practices in everything that I did, whether it's diverse speaker lists or implementing family care grants for conferences. And then suddenly, because I started being active in this, everyone I knew started asking me questions and wanting me to be an expert. So there's this cycle of then me feeling like I need to educate myself even more to be knowledgeable enough to even speak on this topic. That rapidly became extremely exhausting, sort of feeling this responsibility to educate people in one-on-one conversations again and again. And so then I had the opportunity to be part of the leadership of the ALBA network, which was just launched in 2018. And that has been for me a really tremendous opportunity to have a constructive outlet that's in a centralized way where I can work together with other people who have thought deeply about these issues and who care and who are willing to put in some effort to improve things within neuroscience specifically. So that's my story. And so now I'm the chair-elect. I'll be taking over in a few weeks as chair of the ALBA network. And I'd like to encourage anybody who's interested to look us up and we can talk more about some of the actions and contributions that we're trying to make.
Thank you, Megan. I think your words and your experiences have resonated with many of us as we've ascended through our careers, if you can call it an ascension. And when I hear your words, I'm reminded we're often told, give me the wisdom to accept that which I cannot change. But I think you are an example of give me the courage to change that which I will not accept. And I think I'm hoping that this is the community we've drawn to us as attendees. So our next speaker, I am very happy to welcome Dr. Oliver Rollins. Dr. Oliver Rollins is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Louisville. Currently, his research focuses on the social and bioethical implications of neuroscience research on implicit bias. He utilizes qualitative sociological methods to explore the potential challenges, consequences, and promises of operationalizing racial prejudice and identity as neurobiological processes. He is the author of Conviction, The Making and Unmaking of the Violent Brain. His book traces the development of neuroscience research on antisocial behaviors and on crime. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you. Thank you. So my story is obviously a little different from others because I'm a sociologist, and so not a neuroscience, but I actually want to kind of think about, I guess the story I want to tell actually kind of begins, with my background, which, I have a multidisciplinary background. My undergrad was in biology, my master's is in Pan-African Studies, and then I have a PhD from UCSF in medical sociology. And what I really want to kind of focus on, I guess at the start of this, is just thinking about, why I ended up leaving, I think, biology as a student and moving toward more of the social sciences. And I think part of that was a question about, what biology was not giving me as a young Black male, student, and what it could or could not answer, right? And so there was many times sitting in biology class, thinking about, why is this important to me? I mean, a lot of us do that, but particularly why is this important in the sense of the types of problems or questions that are facing me as a Black man, right? And that there's no one there, or there was no one there for me to really be able to state why this should be important as well, right? Or why I needed to stay. And actually what I found is that the outlets where I could actually have those conversations were in Black studies, were in sociology, were in the social sciences. And so one of the challenges I think about is like, how we are reaching out to our students and being able to relate to those students if we are going to actually keep them in the sciences. And again, and I'll probably harp on this a lot, this can't be something that's just for marginalized professors to do, right? The work can't just fall on the shoulders of those who are already marginalized. We all have to play a role in this if we're actually going to have an equitable science and equitable, academy in that way. The other kind of, I guess, if you think about, interventions that I kind of think about, I mean, part of this starts just with, for me as a social scientist who's studying the neurosciences, I think very, critically and deeply about collaboration. Like, what is that collaboration supposed to look like? What is my role as a social scientist to, because my role, I will say, one, that my role is not to say the neurosciences are wrong or that we shouldn't be doing this, right? I think about my work as, how do we make this better, right? So like, how do we make this science better? Like, what can we do? Who can we engage with? What are the perspectives that come from sociology that can help us like engage with these things, particularly when many of our questions, all of our questions or all of what we do is for this larger social cause, right? We usually are trying to fix these social problems within society, these questions within society, or just make things better. And so one of the questions I ask, well, better for who? Right? Like, who is going to be able to benefit from our knowledge that we're producing, right? And then what are the things that we don't, think about or overlook? And part of this may be coming from just like training, right? In ways in which, many of us and all of us are kind of siloed the more you go up, right? The more you go throughout academia, you're siloed where you're not necessarily engaging with the social sciences or sciences in that way. And so part of that is I'm just trying to break that, right? That we can, engage with that. So my students who work with me in sociology, they have to be able to read neuroscience and think about neuroscience. I work with like neuroscience students as well, who then have to be able to think about what are these concepts within sociology to help them think through, these kind of ideas in the work that they're doing. I've worked as a postdoc in the Center for Neuroscience and Society at the University of Pennsylvania with Martha Fair, which was actually really helpful in the sense of both me helping to think about, what are the things that I may miss about neuroscience, but also just engaging with them on an everyday basis, I think helps for them to think through these problems. Like, you can just, knock on the door and say, hey, I'm having this thought about this, to kind of think through these things. So in that way, I think collaboration is important. And then also, and I'll close on this, so, as Bruce opened up with, obviously we really thought about how to, rethought, I guess, what DEI is supposed to mean for the academy, coming off of last summer and in the events of last summer. And one of the things I wanted us to think about, for me, I serve on a lot of, diversity and anti-racism panels, and just to be thinking about, what is that, what are those things supposed to mean for us within science? What are they supposed to mean for us in the academy? What are we trying to achieve from that? And also, even for the folks who are not necessarily comfortable, I guess I should say, of talking about these things and doing these things. Like serving on those panels, I think also is for that, right? As I tell my students all the time, if you were comfortable in my class on race, then I'm not doing my job, right? These are uncomfortable conversations that we're supposed to be having. So serving on these things, I think actually helps educate ourselves also on what potential things we can do both in the lab and outside of the lab.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. Those are great points, and I'm sure we'll circle back in a lively discussion, both from the Q&A also among the panel members. So let's hold those thoughts because there are a couple of things I want to come back to as well. So our next panelist is Dr. Utta Hageshwander, who is a professor of neuroscience at the College of Medicine at Central Michigan University. She's the head of the bioluminescent optogenetics lab, where she leads a diverse team of researchers. Together, they work to develop and apply tools that use biological light to activate light-sensing molecules to investigate the underlying mechanisms and potential of non-invasive treatment of neurological and psychiatric disease. Her Brain Initiative projects with NIH and NSF have included several diversity supplements, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about that today. She's worked with tribal communities in her area to build trust and encourage individuals to continue their education through applying to colleges and universities. So Utta, please, we'd love to hear from you and your perspectives and experiences.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I wanted to share our experiences regarding two different diversity, equity, inclusion aspects. The first one is inclusion of researchers and especially trainees from underrepresented communities regarding race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background. When the Brain Initiative sent out emails about diversity supplements, I subsequently sent out information and flyers about opportunities in my lab to lists of URM students, to tribal colleges. We are sitting on Chippewa land here, to rural colleges all throughout Michigan, thinking that offering such opportunities should result in an enthusiastic response. Far from it. I got absolutely zero responses when I did this. I was operating under the wrong assumption that A, the students would know that such opportunity potentially would be good for them, but why should they know? How could they know? And B, that their mentors and institutional officials would simply trust me. But why should they? Putting it into historical perspectives, they have actually little reason to do so. So a much better strategy is to reach out to individuals directly, start building relationships and trust, visit colleges and classes in person, and talk to students directly. Not wait that somebody comes to you, but go out and talk to them. While this one person at a time, person-to-person interaction is much more time and energy consuming, it has a much better chance of making a difference. An example actually from my home institution is when I gave a presentation to a group of pre-med honor students. Again, rather than waiting for a student to come up to me and inquire about working in the lab, I literally grabbed a student and started a conversation. Doing this, I roped in a talented URM undergrad who stayed in my lab for 3 years and is now attending a neuroscience graduate program at an Ivy League school. Now, the second type of experiences I want to share pertains to institutional inequity and engagement between different types of institutions, which is another goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Now, my lab is in a geographically and perceptually, let's say, challenged place, this being the flyover zone, the 3, 4, 5, whatever institution. What has been working for us and our colleagues at Brown University and UCSD in developing and maintaining partnerships and collaborations among investigators from research-intensive institutions and institutions that are less so, again, is engagement between motivated individuals. From our experience, it is not sufficient for just the PIs to interact regarding writing grants and manuscripts. What really makes a difference are weekly online combined lab meetings engaging everybody in the respective labs, postdocs, grad students, staff. Other great opportunities have been exchange of lab members between the participating labs and cross-mentoring of trainees. Now, we have been doing this cross-country engagement for several years, even before the pandemic. After all, why not take advantage of the internet? Such partnerships and collaborations remotely and across state lines can be very successful and rewarding to all involved. With more people now having gotten a bit more comfortable with online interactions, this would be a great time to start such interinstitutional engagement. And I stop with that now.
Great, thanks very much. And I really appreciated hearing from all four of you. Different experiences, different outlooks, but really kind of driving toward many, many shared goals. There's a whole slew of questions on the chat. I don't even know where to start. Maybe I can ask one of my own while we kind of sort this out between Elba and myself. I mean, what I'm seeing and hearing here is it comes down to creativity and initiative, right? And we're scientists. This is what we purport to do. And what's really inspiring to me is seeing it applied in this space in the service of doing better science and doing better science for more people. But what do you folks, in your experience, what have been the barriers? I mean, I've experienced this myself. I mean, not just institutional, how shall we say, ambivalence or apathy to this, but I'm sure we've all had colleagues who said, well, is this a problem we need to fix? And what are you doing this for? You're not being rewarded. I mean, what's your experience for that? And never mind just that, but how do we kind of break down those barriers? I mean, I've experienced them. I know you folks must have in some way, shape, or form. What have been your strategies to just power through and to get stuff done and to change people's minds on that? I'd just love to hear from all of you on that.
I'm happy to start if you want, John. And I also see one of the questions in the chat is what were the barriers to entry in establishing the internship? And the answer is they were everything. Every single thing you could imagine was harder for these kids than for other kids. Like, the internships must be paid. They cannot they cannot go a summer without earning a salary. Their family needs a salary. They don't have PCPs. They don't have vaccination records. They don't have a car, so they can't get to interviews. They don't have a parent who can take them to an interview during the day, during the week, and have a space in their home where they can set up a nice little office. During COVID, they were much more likely to live in multi-generational families, so it was much more dangerous for them to go in. So I think, part of that, so for us, the partnership with My Brother's Keeper was everything. We would never have been able to establish this without them. They knew these kids, they knew how to support them, they knew the issues they were going to have. And so, for me, partnering with local organizations was a huge facilitator to getting things to work.
Yeah, and another aspect might be sometimes you get comments like, well, if those kids are really smart and really alert, they'll come to you. But that has not been my experience, and it's not a criterion for being smart or not at all. Some kids I have in the lab from URM groups, and let's say they have an uncle who is a surgeon, they have another perspective. But a lot of these kids they have never left Flint, Michigan, etc. And once you open up their minds, there's an incredible resource there.
Yeah, these comments really resonate with me. I mean, I came to learn, and it was an education for myself as a teacher and as a mentor, that my experience growing up wasn't their experience growing up. And for many of these kids who came to college, first ones in the family, maybe even to make it out of high school, from very, very different backgrounds, and they were actually fortunate to be at a a great university, but they were in a completely alien environment. And so to expect somebody who's really, really smart and really, really motivated to quote unquote behave or navigate our environment as we've known it so well as with the facility that we have is a really bad assumption, right? So I think it's a really great point. You gotta meet these kids where they are and kind of, bring them in. I think that's a really great point.
I don't know if you would like Oliver and I to weigh in on the barriers of that. I was just going to say, so working with neuroscientists, it's a slightly different set of barriers, right? And so I see there's also a question here about how to deal with pushback. I think for me, one of the biggest barriers are colleagues who just don't see a problem. Or don't think that this should be a priority, or are convinced that a very common view is like, oh yeah, either it was in the past, or oh yeah, there are those other institutions that have these problems, but fortunately, I'm at a place where we don't have those problems, and so I think in that kind of situation, there are three things that I would usually say to people. One is that everybody should follow the data. And so, study after study after study has been done that shows systemic effects of biases, and even very small biases at each stage. You can model it with computational models, leads to really massive gaps at the top of any kind of hierarchy. These biases accumulate, and it can really be detrimental to careers. And so, do you have evidence that you don't have a problem? Because your null hypothesis should be that there is a problem, because that's what we know from almost every study that's been done. So we're scientists, we should be able to follow that data. And then the second thing is that, we're clearly missing out on tremendous amounts of talent, and we should want the most talented people regardless of their backgrounds of any kind. And so that's obviously really bad for science. And then the last thing is just that, inclusive environments are good for everybody. These are positive environments that are good for individual people and are good for science. And so, why not try to make things better for all of us? It's just good for science in the end.
I really appreciate those comments. Oliver.
Yeah, I would kind of echo much of what Megan was just saying. And for me, it's both a question of like not seeing a problem, but actually not really fully defining what this problem is, right? So, the way we've thought about DEI is that we can, even though we're not doing a good job of it, we can hire ourselves out of this, right? As long as we hire and train enough people of color, this problem is going to automatically take care of itself. And that's not going to be the case, right? And so I think one of the things that we have is that we have a normative problem about, in the ways in which we think about what science is, but I think in the larger academy, what productivity is, right? What we value as being productive, what we value within the academy. I think we need to step back and think about that, and think about who gets left out, right? Who can't, like all of these stories are a part, from what everybody's saying, is also pushing on this fact that some people need so much more help, or they're not even at that point where they can actually do school, do college, or even be an assistant professor in the ways in which we're asking them to do it, right? And we're not necessarily rewarding the people who actually are taking the time to do kind of the DEI work, right? So I think on the one hand, we need to think about our priorities in that way, in which we usually are like, you can do science, you can do everything in the academy without ever having to worry about DEI. You can literally be rewarded throughout your life. You can be a very successful professor and never have to worry about these things. The people who do have to worry about these things are usually penalized throughout their careers because they had to take time to do this. So I think one of the things is we have to think about rewarding those people who are actually doing that work, if not penalizing the folks who refuse to do the work, right? Because if we're actually going to have a structural change in this, right, we can't just allow the ways in which we, normally operate things to kind of be the ways in which we normally do operations, because that is part of the problem. And I think as much as we need to define and think about the problem, we also need to think about what we're doing now in this kind of normative sense that's creating or helping to regenerate these types of situations.
Yeah, that's a great point. So much of what we do is based on a reward system. And we have to take the long view of what are the appropriate rewards? Well, what are the appropriate outcomes that really deserve the big rewards. And if it's, I would contend that it's developing a better network of minds, not leaving talent on the table, as Megan has alluded to, that I think will do have the longest lasting benefit. So these are certainly resonating thoughts here.
I'm going to jump in because there's some really incredible questions in the chat, and there's a lot of them. And this is a great question from Tim Brown. It's a follow-up to Oliver's comments here. And I think people are eager for examples of things that they can do as they craft their action plans. So Tim writes that he's worried that attempts to diversify the workforce will tokenize or burden underrepresented minorities. And certainly we know that's the case. And so when we tap URMs into labs, they will be the folks who are tapped to be mentors, sit on the panels, take on research related to DEI. So he's interested in your ideas for actions. How can we protect and empower underrepresented minorities we recruit, and how can we prevent burnout? Do you have any thoughts for actions, things we can do specifically?
Yeah, well, I think first, just going back to that point around, this question of like rewarding those particular types of actions. And that could be things like, semester off from teaching, like course releases, there's things that we can do within the academy that we already do, right? Course releases, grants, all of these things that we could be doing and rewarding people for doing that type of work, right? And protecting them in that way, right? Particularly assistant professors who, many like me as an assistant professor and a person of color end up being on all of this service work very early because we are the representation that, you supposedly need for this, right? And part of that problem is exactly as Tim is pointing to here, is that you get burnt out. Like you just absolutely get burnt out because it's really hard to say no when you know that you're probably the only person who's going to do that, right? Who's going to do that work. And we're not asking anybody else to do their work, or people could easily say that they don't want to do their work. And so, I think the question is both on the one hand, learning how to, of course, everyone says like, we need to learn how to say no. And there is a realistic, point to that. But then there's another way in which I think institutionally we could be protecting junior professors in ways, and just professors in general, and particularly women of color. Because I think even particularly at my institution, like, our anti-racist board, our, board on the Commission of Race and Ethnicity, these are all ran by Black women, right? And so like, what does that mean for us to actually rely on those folks so much to kind of do that work without actually rewarding them or giving them the resources to actually do that work? Because that's the other part of it. Part of the burnout comes because you're not actually even giving the resources to do that particular type of work. And that's a commitment at the institutional level, right? And that we could actually be pushing our institutions to do more of.
And I think it could be part of the promotion process. Sorry, I was just saying, I think it can and should be part of the promotion process. Like it should be something, if we value it, then we should value it.
One of the things I see a lot from people who are not part of minority groups, it's very common, to have comments like this to sort of say, well, it shouldn't be all the women and the URMs doing this work. And I think sometimes it's challenging for people who are not part of these groups or who don't have the lived experience, shall I say. And I think sometimes there's a certain level of intimidation that they feel because they don't want to do the wrong thing and they maybe don't feel empowered to do it. And, what I think is that it's actually not that hard to educate yourself and to listen, right? To ask your colleagues and pay attention. I work at an incredibly progressive institution where when people weren't paying any attention to these things, we actually had a full year that went by, and we're all, relatively sort of mid-careers, the senior as we get, and there was a whole year that went by where our external seminar series, we didn't have a single woman. But nobody was paying attention, right? So I started counting. I started making tick marks. I started going to seminars, right? And keeping track of who was asking the questions. And even though we're over 50% female, Portugal is an amazing place for women in science. Our community is over 50% female, and 15% of the questions were being asked by women. And most of those were the PIs, and so when you sort of start to look in your own environment and pay attention, and it didn't have to be me doing that, right? Anybody could be keeping track of these things and trying to figure out simple things. So, we had a simple change in policy, which was that when the moderator is giving out the microphone, they were already prioritizing PhD students. And we said, well, could you please also, prioritize women and other underrepresented people from the community? So it's not rocket science, right? And so there are things you can do. And of course, it is important to listen to make sure you're solving the right problem, right? Educate yourself about what the actual problems are and listen to your colleagues, please.
Another thing which might be really necessary in the kind of collective thinking is that these types of committees, it's kind of stupid to say that only somebody who is a person of color can work in a committee dealing with that. I mean, if I'm in a gardening committee, I don't have to be a gardener. I can make decisions just from logic. So this notion of that's their problem has to be replaced by, do we want a better science or not?
Yeah, sometimes I hear many of these things come up. They can run along the continuum. Well, I don't know what to do, and sometimes the person truly doesn't know what to do, and they might be a little intimidated to ask. I mean, we make a lot of assumptions. So and so is at this level in science, they're in this stature. Sometimes we don't realize there might be a little bit of intimidation there, but there also sometimes there's an excuse factor going on as well. So how do we make it easier for people to ask, or to ask the question that might not be have that complicated answer, but they just need a little help to get over that barrier, whether it's one of ignorance or intimidation or just arrogance, quite frankly. But how do we kind of get people over that barrier? Sorry, Bruce, you were about to say something.
Right. Yeah. So this is somewhat tangential to that, but I wanted to follow up on what Megan said about it not being that hard. I think that there is enormous untapped energy for these types of things. Okay, so establishing the internship was my idea, but my lab manager, Allison Stevens, and RA, Devini Cordero, they put a huge amount, like this thing would never have worked without their passion and energy. And it's, they just cared so much about making it work. And I think that's out there if you can just tap into it.
And that's a great segue for another question in the chat from Cara Ramos, and it's about untapped energy. And sometimes we are silos. We live in silos, and we're not casting a broad enough net. And we need to look farther than our immediate group. And so Cara asked a question for Oliver. She really appreciates your comments. And in your experience, what success factors support neuroscientists in integrating broader societal considerations into their work? How can we achieve this if we're, for example, a membrane biophysicist but wants to do this?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I think part of my argument is that this also needs to go beyond just the people who, study race or do race, because that's also, or gender or any of these things, because that's also not going to lead to these transformative changes that you need. You actually do need everyone to be able to kind of be on board with these things. I guess in part, thinking about both what Bruce and Megan were just saying about, is this easy or hard, and kind of the institutional problem. So I think in one way, it's like, I guess I'm thinking about, what counts as success, because so much of this is actually really hard. And the payoff for this, we don't immediately see, right? So much of this, I think, and that may go to the ways in which we already set up academia, as John was saying, where there's always, this kind of idea that we need some kind of, reward, and that we're in this reward system. But so much of this work, as Bruce was saying, like you don't necessarily see that outcome, that immediate outcome. And I think that's also hard, right? That's always been a hard thing just within society when we think about what problems we decide to deal with and which ones we don't. A lot of them had to do with that instant gratification that this problem is quote unquote solved, and this is not going to be the case. Like I could say that DEI is not going to be something that after this, we're going to come back next year and everything is going to be fine, right? One, we don't even know where we're going. Like we don't even know what it means when we're saying thinking about a diverse, neuroscience. So one, we have to go back to kind of thinking and defining that problem, but also that it's not going to be that easy. But I do think the other thing that I would think about is the ways in which, the work that we do, leads to, I guess, thinking about how this knowledge is going to be picked up within society, right? And who's going to benefit or not from particular types of things within society. Those questions I think we can ask about our own work, right? Without having to be totally educated about, what these kind of, things mean, but we can ask like, okay, how is my work going to be picked up? Who's going to be picking, and can we advocate then for more equitable ways in which these things can be picked up? Those are these kind of success things I can think about. The other things I think that we do need to think about is so I'm writing a piece actually with two neuroscientists right now, which is in an R&R stage, and we are kind of thinking about, whether or not you drop this term race or not in the neurosciences, which has been this kind of question that keeps coming back up. Do we just not say this term race because of the negative connotations it has? And part of our argument is that we also need to think about race and identity beyond just that kind of social identity thing, right? So there's who's in our study, who's in our lab, and think about it much more as we do in the social sciences, as a social practice, as a kind of social political thing that means much more than just who I am, but also how I'm being treated, how society is being structured, right? And all those types of ways. Now that requires education, as Megan was saying, like that requires us to rethink this. But I would argue that many of these questions that we're asking that are social questions, right? We should be educated on how social factors actually matter within society, either coming from the social sciences. Because for me, as someone who studies the neurosciences, I have to be educated on how fMRIs work. I have to be educated on how the brain works for me to even do the research that I'm doing. And I think there should be kind of a reciprocal kind of thing. If you're asking kind of social problems, if you're doing social neuroscience, and you should also be pretty educated on how these social dynamics work within society. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks. And there is a great question related to that. And I think it's one that probably all of us have dealt with at one time or another. How do you deal with pushback from colleagues who don't think there's a problem and don't see diversity as a priority?
I think I already gave my answer to that one.
I think you did, and panelists, because this is really the crux of it, right? I'll contribute something at the end, but I really am curious to see if Bruce or Oliver, Utta, or John want to weigh in here on this one.
I mean, I know there are still people around who think women should not vote or should not work. I mean, at some point you just give up. You can't change everybody's mind, but the way things are progressing, and like with bottom-up work from individuals and with top-down initiatives from granting agencies, and hopefully also from like institutional tenure committees, et cetera, I think it will become more and more a change. So the person coming up to you and saying, what problem? To some extent, they can either close their eyes or they can start watching.
Maybe I do have one more thing to say on this topic. I think that one of the issues I come up against a lot is that there are people who really think that this is a meritocracy and that it's working. And I think, again, they need to see data to understand that it's not working, and also just to understand this point about, small biases at each stage and how those accumulate to cause really much larger problems. But, the myth of the meritocracy is really the very dangerous thing. And to that, I would say, we're neuroscientists, right? We are fully aware of the fact that we're living with massive cognitive biases in other areas. And to me, it's always been a bit strange, the ease with which people can sort of say, oh yeah, sure, cognitive biases exist in these other spheres. But, the scientific progression and career hierarchies are clearly real meritocracies. And I think that's just incredibly problematic if you think about it on any sort of deep, serious level.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that, when I hear that, my immediate question is, well, what are your metrics for determining for merit, right? I mean, this is the kind of the paradigm shift we need to start pushing a little bit harder on. And I totally agree. I mean, you just need to be data driven. Right? We're scientists, and I think there's it's interesting how some of us, and I'm not saying I'm immune to this either. We think we're being analytical here, and we just use our assumptions there. And sometimes it's on our science too. And how do you kind of break through that that barrier?
Yeah, and I would add that, again, I think, I mean, I'm a sociologist, so I constantly think about these things as like these structural problems, but like, so, for many universities in the US, at least, there's a lot of, requirements, I think, by students to take a DEI class or take some kind of like, cultural sensitivity class or things like that as part of their larger curriculum. And one of the things I raise, because I teach a class on race in the US and race and science and race and ethnicity, and I always raise this question about, where else do you have these conversations at on campus, right? And most of them will say nowhere, only in this classroom, right? And so I was like, so if you think about this, the university, while doing a great thing of like trying to actually encourage these conversations, has actually siloed these conversations to very specific places and times on campus, which means that, if you are in a biology lab or if you're in, any other kind of place, you don't necessarily even have to think about engaging with this, right? And so part of this is like, not just incentivizing, but actually having a full conversation around campus around this. Like we all think we're doing a good job because we have this on campus, but it's actually falling on the burden of just, people in women's studies or people in, in certain places to have these conversations, right? And so that's also kind of letting people off the hook. And so like, I mean, for me personally, thinking about race and racism, not everybody's going to care about this. And we do have to learn how to actually work the best we can with our allies as well. I think Megan has talked about this before around like, who are these allies and how do you become an ally? And it's not just a question of becoming ally, but then also thinking and strategizing what are the best things to do, with those types of allies, right? Because a lot of times, you need kind of that critical mass before anybody else is going to kind of jump aboard too. And so you need to kind of be thinking about, what can we do? So something like that, like how do we rethink those requirements so that we have a bigger conversation around campus and not simply just siloing it. So thinking about the things that we're already doing that we think are good, and also rethinking how to be more active in all of this. And I mean, we all, are professors. And so we always have ideas and things to think, to talk about. So I know that there's better ways to do this, and we can be talking about those and be contributing from people, not just in the social sciences for it.
I think that's a fantastic point. And that integration of these principles into everything that we do every day, and that moving it from, the one diversity training session you have into your everyday experience, that is a place where absolutely, Oliver, we need the allies to take that leading role, right? If I'm the one pointing out, some sort of inadvertently sexist attitude in a meeting, or when we're reading letters of recommendation for PhD applicants or faculty members, right? And there's gendered language in letters of recommendation, and you need to be aware of that when you're writing the letters, but you also need to be aware of that when you're reading the letters, right? And if I'm the one pointing out the gendered language in the letter of recommendation, it isn't going to be taken as seriously as it is if my male colleagues are the ones pointing that out. So that's why, in that particular space, moving these things into these everyday conversations, there's no substitute for good, strong allies. It's really so important.
And I would just like to offer a particular action that people can undertake if you really want to expand people's awareness. And I think all of us are probably guilty to some extent of surrounding ourselves with people who think like we do. And so we form these silos. And so when we're in a silo, another person talking at us is not necessarily effective. So what I like to do is show people and include them so that they feel welcome and not threatened or feel like they're the outsider or the bad person. And a simple thing that people can do is take a colleague, you choose your colleague and send them to SACNAS or ABRCAMS or ACES, the organizations where they are going to experience the realities of what young students of color are experiencing. That is a very different kind of experience than having a peer tell you something. I think most of us are just set in our ways and isolated and don't think broadly enough. And I cannot tell you how many people I have taken to SACNAS who believe there aren't enough minorities, all of that. They walk into a SACNAS room and it's like they've been hit with a bucket of cold water because they could not imagine the thousands of minorities that we have trained already. So I think there's a lot to be said for including people as a partner, even if you think they're not. Then they become that which we imagine them to be. And I think we're getting close to the end of the hour. John, do you want to grab another question from the chat, or?
Yeah,
this has just flown by. I feel like we're starting. I feel like we're starting, and I really hope that we save this chat. We're able to save the chat, that our VFairs people can save that for us, because there's some fertile ground here for future activities, I think, John.
I think so. I mean, one question I had is, oftentimes people will say, and I think believe, oh, I can't really make a difference here. You know, if I help one student, is it enough? You know, how do you view that? I mean, I've always held the view that you build a community one person at a time. And what's been your experiences? I mean, and ultimately, what's been the reward for you in doing this?
I guess I would say I don't see those two as in competition. I mean, doing it one person at a time doesn't mean that you can't have an impact. You know, I mean, one of the things that we did as part of the internship is we established this one-on-one mentoring thing. And when we put out calls for mentors, we got so many responses that we realized it didn't have to be limited to the internship. It could be a wider mentoring program. And so, you know, we have dozens of people at every level within MGH who are willing to be mentors, who are willing to just meet with these kids, you know, an hour a week. And I think that's, you know, an hour a week, like, who can't make that commitment to spend an hour a week trying to make some high school kid's life better, you know, talking to them about sociology or linear algebra or neuroscience, whatever it is that they're struggling with. Like, you know, we could all have some type of impact if we just put in some effort.
I think another thing that I think about a lot is I think, you know, this is really a social justice issue. So, you know, during the pandemic, obviously, our collective awareness of all kinds of social injustices was really heightened. For me, you know, I feel like the level at which I'm working with ALBA and within neuroscience is the sphere of influence where I can sort of do the greatest good, right? And so I see it as a social justice issue that's much larger than us. And I just try to act within my sphere of influence. And everybody has a sphere of influence, right? Whether you're a postdoc in a lab meeting, and maybe, you know, you're a leader within that community. And if we all sort of identify where are our spheres of influence, where can we make the biggest difference, then we can all make a difference.
And I think that it is not incompatible to have a just system be an incredibly rigorous and dynamic scientific system. I would say that if it's not just, it cannot be, because it's biased.
Absolutely.
Right, and I really agree with you, Megan, about this being, it is certainly a social justice issue, but you touch on another issue as well, and it's the opportunity cost of not engaging the talent that's available to us. I mean, why leave talent on the table? It's a little bit nuts, if you ask me, quite frankly. Right? So I think, again, these ideas are not incompatible, but I think it's a matter of framing some of these issues in a way that people who are maybe not quite as interested in could receive them a little better and just kind of help them along. So I think are we coming up on time here?
We're coming close to the end, and there have been questions in the chat about persons with disabilities and inclusion for those communities. It would be great if somebody could speak to that specifically, how we do that, how we do a better job, how we do it in neuroscience, because I think that's important to address.
Any of our panelists have experience or thoughts here? It certainly is an important issue.
Yeah, I could mention, not in my lab, but I saw it in a colleague's lab, and I was at Duke, a person with disability was a student wanted to do an internship in the lab, and because the student was wheelchair bound, the student always was put on like computer stuff. The student really wanted to do wet bench work, and the head of the lab went out of her way to buy a refrigerator freezer, which the student could open while sitting there, set the pipette pen up that the student could do the work. So again, it comes down strongly to the individual engagement of the scientist to make something happen.
Yeah, and I had experience over the years mainly in the classroom, teaching students of many different backgrounds, including some with physical and other disabilities. I think one thing that perhaps wasn't said explicitly here is the reward that one can have in pursuing these ideas, these acts. I drew great inspiration from many of my students, especially ones who looked different or had different background, more challenging backgrounds, including their physical abilities or disabilities. I think this is something that is worth mentioning because we learn from our students. Our students just don't learn from us. And I think if we open our minds to realize how much we can learn from them, not just in the experiments they do, but their life experience, how they think about problems, how they approach problems. You know, to me, this is the reward. This is what makes science better, is learning from each other. And we never stop being students. I think that's maybe one take-home message I would say is open our minds to what's out there. And what's out there are the people we work with.
So I think we're nearing the end, and I'd like to thank our speakers. This has been exciting. I feel galvanized myself. And I guess for the audience, I would like to challenge everybody to walk away from this event and have one action that you will undertake. No action is too small, truly. It is our collective actions that are needed. And so whatever it is, please, please think of one thing you're going to do in the next 3 months or 6 months that will make the change we know we all want to see. And thank you again to our speakers.
I'd like to echo that. And again, we hope that this panel help people think about what they can do, what you can do to build more inclusive and more effective teams in the interest of doing better science and serving more people. I wrote a couple bullets down just from the discussion here. Something to think about. I mean, not to be prescriptive or to be restrictive, but some of the things I heard were be data driven, right? We're scientists. We need to kind of not forget that. And when we tackle tough problems, listen to the data, interpret it, and find a solution. Get educated. We all come into any situation with some assumptions. Check your assumptions, get the data, get educated about it. Do something. You'd be surprised how not hard it is to make a difference. It might be in 1 or 2 students that you encounter, but it's a huge difference in their lives. And that's, again, not exclusive to other larger programmatic things that you can do, and see the rewards in what you do. I think as your colleagues, you may have colleagues that are less interested. They may be either ambivalent, apathetic, or just downright not interested at all. You know, if we see our colleagues having a good time or having a reward, whether it's a personal reward or professional reward, doing some of these things, I think this is how we can bring people along. So, and I think one thing is to incorporate this into everything we do, not to silo these as, okay, I checked a box, I'm going to put that piece of paper in a drawer until somebody makes me take it out again. Find ways to incorporate that into everyday lives, whether it's, you know, in a lab meeting, mentoring students, taking students out for coffee, whatever. Just find ways to incorporate it. I think we all can surprise ourselves for what we actually can do to change things. And, you know, hopefully if enough of us get on board and do it, it's all about doing this on the ground and finally engage the younger generation. The change is going to happen for the people that we mentor, that we train, that we engage in the enterprise. This is our future, and I think we need to make sure that we bring them in and listen to them to see what ideas they have to address these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I thank you all for being here, for your time, for your thoughts, for your energy and efforts. And I hope that those of you who are attending can really take away at least one or two things that you can do tomorrow to make your workplace and a better place, both for your immediate sphere, but also the larger sphere in general. So thank you all so much. We're really delighted to have this conversation. We will be following up in the coming weeks and months to see where people are. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for putting it together.